So, hello, welcome everyone to today's conversation and lunch and learn from reporting on addiction. This is a topic that we're really excited to talk about with Isabella and hopefully Lev if they're able to join from Stat News. They've spent the last at least few months. I mean, it's a really comprehensive series covering alcohol from all sorts of different angles. And we're really excited to have them talk about what they learned in the process and help inform other journalists that are interested in this topic. Isabella is a reporter from Stat News, where she writes about the Trump administration shaping public health. She's also previously worked as a reporter in California, South Carolina, and Florida. And then Lev is waiting to join. Hey, Lev.
There he
How you doing,
is.
buddy?
I'm good. Second time this week that's happened with Riverside, so thank you for
Your
bearing with me.
timing is perfect because I was just getting to your part of the introduction. So
Let's go.
Lev covers substance use and addiction for Stat, and his reporting has explored America's deadly hostility to addiction medications, subpar treatment offered in jails and prisons, shifts in the illicit drug control supply, consumption behavior, and controversies surrounding harm reduction and recent innovations in addiction medicine. What we're really excited to have both Lev and Isabella talk about today is their 8-part series that was for the most part co-authored, but I did notice that there are some differences in authors throughout them. So I don't mean to exclude any of the other folks that contributed to the series. But we're going to have Lev and Isabella talk about their share about the U.S. alcohol epidemic. They interviewed more than 100 health researchers, doctors, patients, industry insiders, and lawmakers throughout the course of their reporting. And as I was just talking to Isabella about, they even just had another article that came out 10 minutes ago. So they continue on this beat around alcohol and the related topics. So if you're interested in following that, we'll share some links to their reporting and their profiles, but they're at Stat News, which is a health-related news outlet that really covers a number of these different topics related to drug use and addiction. They also, of course, reviewed scientific literature, addiction treatment protocols, laws and public health guidance, and lobbying disclosures. So let's jump into it. Isabella, if you don't mind starting, why did you think alcohol was an important topic to cover, especially in such detail as you all covered it?
Well, this series or the seed of it actually started several years ago. Since I cover chronic disease, I was getting acquainted with the various illnesses and got really interested in liver disease because it's a condition where people are often stigmatized or judged for causing their own illness. And through that, started learning just how many cases are driven by alcohol, what a big burden it has on the transplant system, and started talking to Lev about it since he's our addiction reporter. And it was really at the end of last year after we'd seen the Trump administration talking a lot about nutrition and health and how corporations influence our health day to day, that we noticed alcohol was basically nowhere to be found in this MAHA, Make America Healthy Again agenda. And so we decided, now's the time to really tell that story and do it comprehensively with all the notes we'd collected over years, basically.
That's so interesting, Isabella. And I did notice strong themes throughout of tying it into the MAHA movement, which we can talk more about in a little bit, but also that focus on liver-related disease. So that's a really interesting background and how you kind of got into it. Lev, was there anything that you wanted to share about kind of why you jumped at this topic?
Issa covered it very well. I think at the end of the day, we realized that through Issa's work on chronic disease and mine on addiction writ large, we both were just already writing about alcohol all the time. We just didn't necessarily do that intentionally or explicitly. So given how many alcohol related harms we were already covering in the course of our day-to-day jobs, it finally just felt like time to actually pursue a project through an alcohol focused lens, as opposed to ending up covering this very, very deadly, impactful, harmful substance, incidentally by happenstance.
Oh, that's so interesting, Lev. So, and it feeds very nicely into our next question. So thank you for that. How did it, and every newsroom's different, I want to acknowledge that, but how did it kind of come about in pitching that to the editors or getting that buy-in from the newsroom? Because I imagine with the stories like this, it's 8 articles. I don't know if it's the end at the 8 articles, but certainly there's been the 8 articles. There continue to be articles that you're publishing on alcohol. I would guess there is a need to get buy-in from editors. How did you kind of get them to focus on alcohol when so much attention has been on stuff like opioids, stuff like cannabis, where alcohol really has been kind of pushed to the side of other reporting?
Yeah, I can give it a stab and Issa can fill in blanks. But I would say, first of all, we're very fortunate to work for a great editor in Laura Chang and Stat's executive editor Rick Burke. They're super supportive. Stat is also a very kind of project driven newsroom. So if we can make a case to editors that there's a topic that isn't being covered in quite the right light or with quite the right tone, and there's a place that we can actually spread some knowledge and drive some impact, that's very very luckily for us something we're typically going to get a green light for. I will also say that Stat is about a decade old, and we're based in Boston, even though neither of us is currently in Boston. But because of that, I think there has been a lot of focus on the opioid crisis. Massachusetts, in particular, has been so affected. Excuse me. Purdue Pharma is a New England company. There are all these kind of very very stat-like Boston-y New England angles to the opioid crisis. And when you can tell someone, hey, that thing, that public health crisis that we've spent really a lot of time and resources and energy covering, what if we told you that there was a substance that actually caused like 150% as many deaths, vastly more harm on a far greater scale? When you put it in that perspective, not to diminish our reporting on the opioid crisis, much of which is mine, to be clear, but it does really kind of paint things in a different light when you talk about this other substance that causes harm on a greater scale, and yet why do we as a society not pay that level of attention to it?
Oh, for sure. And it is something I feel like the experts that I talk to really do notice that there doesn't seem to be a lot of attention on alcohol, and it kind of like slides under the radar. And there's an old saying that you might have heard from some of the experts that like if you talk to a doctor, too much drinking is just more than the doctor drinks. And it's just been so normalized across various domains that like it really does slide under the radar from a reporting perspective. But what I was excited when I saw that y'all were doing the series was that you were going to come at it just whole hog and really tear it apart from so many different angles and leave so many different threads for other journalists to try to explore in their states as well. Isabella, did you have anything that you want to talk about with, I know you mentioned your background in chronic liver disease related things and how that ties into alcohol. But how you kind of thought about approaching editors with this topic, especially from the lane of like, it is so normalized, it is so under the radar. And especially, again, not a journalist, but my understanding is in journalism spaces, alcohol is itself very prevalent as well, where maybe something like opioids is less prevalent. So it's easier to sensationalize or focus on opioids because it's so foreign, where alcohol is like, oh my, everybody drinks alcohol all the time. Like, what are we even talking about here?
Right. Yeah, I think, and also I worked as a local reporter before coming to Stat, so I can fully appreciate the challenges of trying to do project-based work or even more like enterprise storytelling with all the other constraints. But I think the thing about alcohol is it is hiding in plain sight, as we note in our series. And it's also one of these things that cuts across so many different domains that, we could have written probably a 20 or 30 part series on alcohol. There are things we couldn't get to. And once you start asking people about it, it just sort of opens up. Like I had so many conversations with city and county health officials because I wanted to know, hey, what's happening in your community? Where does this fall on the list of priorities? And all of them acknowledge, yeah, this is a constant issue, but these are the barriers we face. So it's not that people aren't thinking about it. It's just like they're not really prompted to talk about it or to share what they're doing or what resources they need. There's, in every community, there's like so many families and individuals being affected by this substance that are, more than willing to talk about it and the effects it's had on them, but no one's really asking. And so I think it is one of those really fruitful lanes of reporting because it's been neglected and because people often don't acknowledge the great harms that can come from it.
Isabel, can I ask you to keep that local reporter hat on? And so, like you said, it was an enterprise, huge package story. If you're thinking about it from a local reporter perspective, and Lev obviously would love for you to jump in too, but how would you suggest that they might be able to tap into this topic? Because like you said, it is so big. But once you kind of peel under the surface a little bit, there's actually a ton of stories that you could tell.
Yeah. Well, I think number one, the data speaks for itself. So if you're able to even look at mortality numbers or alcohol-driven acute causes like hospitalizations and car wrecks and things like that in your community or in your state, that would probably be a story that would be illuminating for many readers in and of itself. You think about the toll on emergency departments. I mean, thinking of this past summer where there was the World Cup going on, where there was heat waves going on, toxic air quality, along with everything else happening on any given weekend, it was probably a nightmare in those emergency departments. And, opening new zones for open container laws or just having big drinking day parties probably contributed to that burden somewhat. And there's constantly stuff like that happening. There is also a trickle constantly of policies at the state and local level that are being pushed by alcohol companies to try and loosen regulations, for example. So that may be something like getting home delivery of alcohol or getting alcohol to be sold in more venues, sports arenas, grocery stores, nail salons, you name it. And then there's the small opposition. So I see we have someone from Columbia, Missouri here. There was Kansas City ordinance recently to ban single shots being sold in gas stations in certain parts of the city because there was a lot of crime associated with those stores. And that has broken into this big contentious fight between alcohol industry interests and the city council and now state representatives. There are a million examples of that across the country. I'm sure there's one happening in your state or in your community. And so there's always something alcohol related to find.
Yeah, Lev, I don't actually remember who was first author on that article, so sorry about that. But there was a really great, all of the 8 articles and supplemental materials were wonderful. But I thought you all did a really nice job of pulling apart some of those industry conflicts like you just talked about there, Isabella. Lev, do you mind talking a little bit about that? And again, adding to Isabella's local angle for how to think about those industry conflicts and how that can lead to some of these issues. Your World Cup example, Isabella, is so interesting. I heard in Philadelphia, they extended the hours for bars to be open. And then I did hear from some friends in the medical community there that was like, yeah, they definitely noticed in the ER that the bars were open later. And it's like, oh, of course. And it's unclear whether or not that's going to change and whatever. But it does seem like there's this movement, like you said, to have more focus on it from a health perspective, but also these industry kind of influences that keep kind of undercutting those effects. So, Lev, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Well, to be honest, Isabella was the lead author on that story, so I'm going to kick it back to her. But I do want to give her credit for something before that because she's very modest and she won't say it. But one of my favorite anecdotes that she reported in that story was about the American Cancer Society and its relationship with the alcohol industry. And they every year held the Wine and Spirits Industry Gala and raked in a ton of money from alcohol industry executives. And I would say pretty much entirely as a result of her reporting, she just published a story this morning that they are no longer holding that gala because it turns out allying with the industry known to manufacture and distribute a carcinogen is not the greatest look for the American Cancer Society. So I'm going to let my colleague answer the bigger picture industry question, but wanted to share that because I think it's a fun, specific, but also kind of bigger picture in a way example of the type of impact this reporting can have.
Yeah, that was another thing that was really, with alcohol, it's like once you start seeing it, you kind of can't stop seeing it all over the place and the fingerprints of how central it is to everything we do. So basically many cancer centers, many healthcare systems have these affiliations, whether it's sponsored events or fundraisers that are very boozy, open bars that are, meant to fundraise for cancer patients or for people with other chronic illnesses that may be caused by alcohol. That is really interesting to me, the fact that there are all these connections that's happening all over the country. But then you also look at things like, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It was something Lev mentioned that captivated me. Well, anyway, you can come back to me, but I think, Lev, you should share more also about from the addiction treatment perspective and local angles on that, because Lev is really our addiction expert here.
Yeah, no, huge. And the addiction treatment part was, again, I really encourage folks to read the full 8 articles and supplemental materials. But he did a really nice job of digging into the various parts of the addiction treatment industry. And I'll say I did not know about 319 or I don't know how they refer to themselves. So that was news to me. But those the different ways that people can find treatment. And I'll say through reporting on addiction, one of the things that we encourage journalists to do if they're covering a topic related to addiction is just try to find treatment in your community. And you'll realize that it's really, really hard. And if it's hard for you as like a well-resourced journalist that's trying to understand the topic, can you imagine what it is for someone that's in crisis? So Lev, thank you, Isabella, for teeing that up. But Lev, if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to dig into treatment, because it is such a complicated and contentious space in alcohol. It's kind of interesting in that way, but also really rich stories there.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that's interesting is you talk about, try to find treatment in your community. And I completely agree that is kind of the starting point for any reporter who's looking to uncover what services are or are not available in a particular place. But then there's also the question of, what does treatment even mean? Because in the alcohol space, treatment and Alcoholics Anonymous are often kind of treated synonymously, even though even AA folks would tell you this isn't really treatment. This is peer support and recovery support. But as with so much of the addiction space, I would say that alcohol use disorder, alcohol addiction is under medicalized, and it's rare that people seeking help for their drinking behavior are going to seek it or especially get it from a physician, from someone who actually works inside our country's healthcare infrastructure. So it was really interesting reporting on how things have evolved in that space in the last many decades. And I do want to be very careful that, I think a lot of people read my story as being anti-Alcoholics Anonymous, and that I don't think that's a fair reading, even though that was a lot of people's interpretation, because AA, there's a decent evidence base behind it, and it's helped literally millions of people. So, whatever works for people, more power to them. Quitting drinking is an incredibly, incredibly difficult thing to do. And that said, there are a lot of people I talk to who reported kind of your typical experiences about finding AA to be controlling or to, some form of spiritual or theistic. And more than anything, takes on kind of the binary approach of, you're having trouble with your drinking. You think this is impacting your life in a negative way. Never drink again. And I think one of the main takeaways from that story was there is a shift in culture within Alcoholics Anonymous and then outside of the 12-step community entirely, where people are starting to view harm reduction and moderation in general as victories. Obviously, it is better for you to have 2 drinks a day than 10 drinks a day, even if your AA sponsor really strongly feels that it should be 0 drinks a day. And then the last thing I would add there is that the role of GLP-1s are really, really upending what treatment for alcohol use disorder looks like in the United States. And we're going to see a lot more on that front in terms of clinical trials and probably a formal FDA approval and indication in the coming years. But even already, off-label prescribing is incredibly common, and kind of the early indications, early data are very, very promising. So that's something to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah,
I remembered
and
what
I saw you
wanted
muted
to
yourself,
add.
Isabel. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. I remembered. So another fascinating thing is the highway safety component of this. So we figured out that there is basically an alcohol industry sponsored nonprofit called responsibility.org that funds a bunch of state highway safety groups to do different projects. And this is through the Governor's Highway Safety Association. Some of that money goes to police departments to do trainings on like phlebotomy, to do drug tests on the side of the road and things like that, which, sounds good, like they get extra money. But also when you think about like the conflicts of interest there, it may be in the alcohol industry's, interest to make drug-related car crashes more prevalent, or for those to be focused on more than alcohol, which is like still the leading substance implicated in car wrecks and deaths. So that is super interesting, like how the police departments are getting resources from the industry. Another local angle, which I wish I would have done when I was working at a local paper, is just looking at the sheer economic impacts of alcohol in your community. So when you think about things like the cost of law enforcement for all of these different causes. There's a lot of domestic violence and homicide and other things that are tied to alcohol use as well. Ambulance EMS in general, jail costs, lost productivity from alcohol, or even like special education from children that were exposed to alcohol in utero. All of these things really add up. When we look at the national level, it's something like almost $250 billion a year, which is more than all Americans' medical debt combined. And that's an estimate from 2010. So it's probably much higher.
Mhm.
So localizing that and also looking at how much tax revenue your state alcohol taxes are bringing in compared to that, whether there's been efforts to raise the tax on alcohol in your state, which there has been in many states. It often doesn't succeed. Comparing all of the financial pieces of this is really eye-opening at times and maybe a good angle to pursue.
Yeah,
Oh, Isabella,
not to
that's such a
reduce
great
this
point.
to sorry, Jonathan, not to reduce this to dollars and cents, but like hard to think of something more burdensome to a healthcare system than an organ transplant and the surgery and the follow-up care that requires medication. So yeah, even if you just look at it from a financial lens, the numbers are really, really staggering, like Isabella said.
No, true. And Isabella, thanks for pointing out the tax part too. There was a wonderful series. It was a few years ago in New Mexico. I think it was New Mexico Spotlight that focused on the tax conversation and how that is really like that is a really great local angle to take. But like you said, it does end up continuing to be defeated usually. And that's why those industry contacts are really, in the industry context end up being a really interesting angle there. Lev, you tickled my harm reduction bone, so I just did want to like flag that, that I did appreciate that you brought that up and mentioned that throughout the articles, or that was mentioned throughout the articles. I think that's a really important thing to talk about. And at Reporting on Addiction, we try to help journalists think about when we think about drug use and addiction, prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and recovery. And so I did see each of those threads throughout the articles, which again, it helps that you had 8 articles, but it was nice to see each of them do that. I did want to talk a little ethics with you. I noticed in one of the articles, and I'm blanking on which one it was one of the treatment-focused ones, but you did refer to an individual and you de-identified them and made a note in the article that you were de-identifying them because of the professional and social repercussions associated with substance use disorders. That's something that Reporting on Addiction, we really encourage journalists to at least be open to and think about. I would be interested if how those conversations kind of happened in your newsroom. Maybe that's already like a well-worn thing at Stat. So if you can reflect on those initial conversations with that approach, because I know not all editors are open to it, and having named sources is a really important part in trusted news. But like you said, there can be those implications. So if you don't mind like kind of talking about that a little bit, I thought that'd be interesting. And I'll share our Reporting on Addiction resources here for the audience, but it's at reportingonaddiction.org. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think, Jonathan, you're probably referring to the main character in the story I wrote about the evolving treatment landscape. Her name is Jillian, and we identified her only by her first name. And there are a couple reasons for that. As you say, like, it's not something we like to do. We like to identify the people we're writing about who are generous enough and trusting enough to share their stories with us, and in turn let us share their stories with the world. But it's really helpful to be able to tell people who you're talking about, who you're quoting, etc. That said, in addiction in particular, substance use is so stigmatized, and honestly, people's trajectories are often not linear. So, the main character in the story, she was about, I wonder how she would categorize it time-wise, because she started going to AA during COVID, and she ended up going to this particular Zoom based AA group that was much more open to harm reduction principles and much less critical of people who had succeeded in reducing but not eliminating their drinking. But that said, people, her recovery has not been linear. She's had good days and bad days, and this is something I've encountered in other areas of addiction reporting too. Like there's a rehab facility I'm thinking of that it does very cutting edge work, very, very effective work, but they have a policy of not offering people with less than 1 year of recovery up for interviews, just because you kind of don't know what people's trajectory is going to necessarily be. And even though that makes my life harder as a journalist, I do really applaud it. So yeah, it wasn't something we had trouble getting our editors on board with, just because the sensitivity and even unpredictability of the topic is so obvious, so in your face. But I can imagine there are other situations where it would be a tougher call, and I think you just have to go case by case and evaluate people, by their specific circumstance and their preferences and their comfort level.
Yeah, the nonlinearity associated with drug use and addiction and recovery is a really, really, really important point. I think especially for journalists that are new to the topic and student journalists. And when we talk to folks that are trying to figure out how to share their story, you can hear from individuals that I used to talk about it one way when I was early in recovery, and now I talk about it totally differently. I really appreciate that y'all were very sensitive to that and thoughtful about that. I have a question here from Kim from the audience. And it is that in part 4, you did I'll say great job, because I think it was more than good, covering addiction treatment on a larger scale, and many treatment options that people have issues with, they just don't work, whether it's loss to referral, the high dropout rates, etc. What did you learn about the overall cost benefit of different treatment options beyond mutual support medications? And kind of a follow-up, did you think about or have any conversations with how insurance ends up paying for some of these things that just don't work as well? And that you kind of, in talking to those experts, you're like, why are we still doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep it quick because there's so much there, and I also don't want to, quote specific numbers that I don't have quite right in my head. So one kind of surprising thing was the cost effectiveness of Alcoholics Anonymous as an intervention is actually pretty fantastic, because the costs are so low. So that's not to say it's effective for everybody, but again, if you're just looking at it via dollars and cents, that was a little bit surprising to me. 28-day rehab is not, in most cases, an evidence-based intervention. A month, 28 days is about what federal and commercial insurers were willing to pay for. Hence the kind of dominance of, you're struggling with substance use, 28 days at some inpatient place in Arizona and in Florida. So unsurprisingly, the cost effectiveness there is pretty terrible. I don't want to quote a specific number. I will say that the lack of value-based care is not unique to addiction medicine. It's pretty rampant, unfortunately, in the American healthcare system writ large, but rehab facilities love it. Many of them, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but if they get recurring patients, it means they're kind of doing something wrong, and it means that they're getting paid these huge sums of money once a year, twice a year, 6 times over the course of a decade. So that's obviously better for their bottom line, and it is a great question for commercial insurers in particular, why they are willing to pay for volume as opposed to value.
So great. Thank you, Lev. And yeah, there was a lot in that question, so thanks for taking it on. We're kind of getting close to time here, but I didn't know if there was any other tips or tricks or kind of things that you wanted to reflect on from digging into this reporting. Like you both said, you've been kind of nibbling at the edges of alcohol for a while, but now that you've gotten deep into it, as Isabella said, once you start pulling that thread, you start to see alcohol really everywhere and the influence of it everywhere. But tips and tricks for other, especially student journalists, but other reporters that are just interested in trying to get started on this. I know there's some great story ideas that the both of you shared, but just some quick reflections kind of on the whole process, if you don't mind.
Well, I think one thing that comes up, which we didn't really get into a lot in the series, is just how much alcohol is holding up, large sectors of the economy. I mean, you think of your neighborhood, there's probably a bar or liquor store, a restaurant that without the sales of alcohol would really, really struggle to exist. And I think that is a reality that needs to be grappled with, both as drinking goes down in the US, which is the trajectory we're currently on, or as communities start to reevaluate their relationship to alcohol. And so I think you could get some really interesting perspectives, from a local barkeep or something. How do they think about this issue? I'm sure they know people who have a problem. How do they grapple with that? There's so many compelling human interest stories in this realm. I mean, there are people I spoke to who grew up before this idea of alcohol being dangerous for your pregnancy was well known, and as a result had children with severe disabilities and whose lives were completely changed just because they didn't have that information. Now there's a lot of people who are thinking, I can drink a bit, I can drink in some parts of my pregnancy, or they're not getting the help they need with an alcohol use disorder before they get pregnant. That is a really compelling story. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are estimated to be more prevalent than autism. When you think about the sheer scale of that in the community, how that could be affecting schools, special education, like parents trying to figure out what's going on with their children, that is worth investigating. And of course, there's the people that are drinking, maybe they don't realize they're drinking too much, and then they have really severe health consequences, whether it's liver disease or, full-blown alcohol use disorder or something else, and fell through a bunch of cracks in the healthcare system. All of those stories are worth telling and are happening wherever you live. So that's my final thought, I guess.
Yeah, really quickly, I think one of my biggest pitfalls as a reporter is thinking, oh, people know that, or oh, that's obvious, or that's not interesting to people. And in all areas of journalism, but I think especially this one, it's just such a bad school of thought. Don't assume people know things. And sometimes just presenting information that's like already vaguely out there, that's kind of like a little bit in the zeitgeist, but doing it in a concrete, understandable, digestible way is one of the most impactful things you can do as a reporter. So I just think a lot of people would be shocked by, the number of hospitalizations in their area due specifically to alcohol, or just overall deaths, or like Isabella said, the economic impact for good and for bad of the alcohol industry. So just don't think. Obviously, everyone's aware that alcohol is very prevalent in our society. Everyone is aware to at least a small degree that alcohol is or can be harmful, but don't think that because there's that baseline level of awareness that this isn't worth reporting on, even in really just like direct, down the middle ways, because that stuff people do find jarring and impactful. And I think that's a good way to start changing conversation, just presenting those readily available facts as they are. Don't trick yourself into thinking they aren't interesting. I promise they are.
Yeah, no. And Isabella, I think your point about alcohol use in pregnancy is really interesting, because especially the changes in alcohol use during like COVID and some of the stuff and the cultural norms around that, like the mommy juice and all of those sorts of things. Alcohol, because it is so prevalent, it does kind of just shift in these interesting ways. I remember in college, like Four Locos, I did not have them, but Four Locos were the thing. And now there are those like seltzers, and there's just always some new product out there to get the next generation drinking alcohol. So
and it's cheap. It's cheap and available, and yeah.
Expected.
Yeah, no, expected, correct, and socially normalized in many ways. So thank you both for taking the time, one, to talk to us, but that was a really small thing. The work that you put into the series, behind the series, to do this reporting is, again, really, really admire it from the outside. It's the type of thing that, as reporting on addiction, we love to like see that sort of attention to detail, thoughtfulness, ethical implications, like all of the stuff that you put into it. So thank you for doing that. Thanks for sharing your perspectives with the audience about other stories to take on, especially for local journalists. And for everybody watching this video, we have additional resources at reportingonaddiction.org related to alcohol, but we also cover other topics related to drug use and addiction. We have a newsletter that you can find at reportingonaddiction.org, and we have a bunch of resources on alcohol. They've actually been very popular, so it does encourage me that folks are interested in this topic. But as you both learned, it's a huge topic. So there's a lot more reporting to be done. So thank you, Lev and Isabella. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for having us. And I put
Thanks,
my email in
Jonathan.
the chat. Feel free to reach out. Happy to help local and student journalists and anyone else.
Yes, likewise.
Thanks, everyone.